This is the true story of Phineas Gage, a man whose brutal accident serendipitously opened the door to a deeper understanding of how the brain works and what makes us who we are. On September 13, 1848, 25-year-old Phineas Gage was working as a railroad construction foreman near Cavendish, Vermont. He led a crew clearing boulders for a new rail line. The work involved drilling holes into the rock, filling them with gunpowder, and using a tamping iron to pack the powder down. The iron rod that Gage used resembles a javelin, about 1.1 meters or 3.5 feet long, with a diameter of about 3 centimeters or 1.25 inches, and weighing approximately 6 kilos or 13 pounds. Standard procedure was to add sand on top of the gunpowder before tamping, a step that Gage may have skipped. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that when Gage tamped the powder, a spark ignited the charge prematurely. The iron bar rocketed out of the hole at incredible speed. It entered beneath Gage's left cheekbone, traveled behind his left eye, and tore through his brain's left frontal lobe. Smashing through the top of the skull, the rod flew out of his head and landed roughly 25 meters or 80 feet away, reportedly whistling through the air, smeared with his blood and brain. The blast threw Gage onto his back, and witnesses saw him convulse a few times on the ground. But incredibly, he remained conscious and aware of what had happened. Within minutes, Gage was speaking, and even walking under his own power. He sat upright in an ox cart for the jostling ride back to town. Back in town, Gage waited on the porch of his hotel for a doctor, chatting with astonished passerbys, all of whom were understandably shocked to see a, quote, volcano of bone sticking out of the top of his skull. When the first physician, Dr. Edward Williams, arrived to treat him, Phineas greeted the doctor with dark humor. "Here's business enough for you." It was the understatement of the century. Dr. Williams provided initial care of the wound, together with another doctor, John Harlow, who would go on to become the primary physician documenting Gage's case. Dr. Harlow at first couldn't believe that the rod had actually passed through Gage's head. That was until he saw the holes in the skull for himself. The two doctors proceeded to clean the wound. They shaved Gage's scalp, removed coagulated blood and brain fragments. They picked out shards of shattered skull bone. At one point, Harlow noted that, quote, "the pulsations of the brain were very distinct." So Gage's brain was literally visible and throbbing through the open hole. Gage threw up about every 20 minutes during the treatment, during which time small chunks of his brain matter reportedly fell out of his head onto the floor. He nevertheless remained alert and surprisingly cooperative, not even seeming to feel much pain. Over subsequent days, however, his condition took a turn. The wound became infected with a fungus, his brain swelled, and he lapsed into a semi-comatose state. It was touch and go for about a week, and at one point a coffin was prepared as his family lost all hope. Yet Harlow's diligent care, including draining the infection, pulled Gage back from the brink. And within 2 months, Phineas Gage had survived and recovered against all odds. Fever gone, wound healed, and remarkably with no loss of speech, memory, or basic motor function. He did lose vision in his left eye, and he had a permanent scar on his forehead, but otherwise he appeared physically on the mend. It was after this physical recovery that the true intrigue of Phineas Gage's story began. Those who knew Gage before noticed that his personality had dramatically changed. The once responsible, mild-mannered, and hard-working foreman was now impulsive, unreliable, and irreverent. In the medical reports, Dr. Harlow poignantly captured the transformation, quote, "The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and his animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires. He has the animal passions of a strong man." In other words, Phineas's moral compass and self-control had been knocked askew, even though his basic intelligence and memory were intact. His friends at one point bluntly remarked that he was, quote, "no longer Gage." Dr. Harlow noted some almost childlike behaviors in the new Phineas. For example, Gage developed an irrationally strong attachment to certain objects. In one instance, Harlow offered Gage $1,000 for a handful of pebbles he'd collected by the river, just to test Gage's judgment, and he refused to part with them, perhaps unable to properly value such a large sum of money. Or maybe he couldn't weigh future rewards or abstract value in the same way anymore. Gage also became curiously attached to the iron tamping rod that had nearly killed him. He carried it with him everywhere, almost like a bizarre security blanket or a trophy. These quirks, along with his profanity and impatience, were in striking contrast to the responsible, even-tempered man he'd once been. Dr. Harlow continued to observe Gage for years and meticulously recorded the changes. In 1848, he had published a brief account of the injury in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. The article was later reviewed in the very prominent American Journal of Medical Sciences. 20 years later, in 1868, Harlow gave a speech to the Massachusetts Medical Society describing Gage's mental changes and recovery. The speech was transcribed and published and became hugely influential. Phineas Gage's case was the first strong evidence linking brain regions to personality and behavior, rather than seeing the brain as an undifferentiated whole. Thanks to Harlow's careful documentation, the medical community learned an immense amount from Gage, insights that would elevate Dr. Harlow's prominence far beyond that of a small-town physician. And indeed, without people like Dr. Harlow writing up such cases, we might never have recognized the frontal lobe's role in personality as early as we did. At the time of Gage's accident, one of the leading theories about how the brain might function was phrenology, the idea that specific mental faculties were localized to bumps on the skull. Phrenologists like Franz Joseph Gall had mapped out the skull into areas for friendliness, combativeness, and so on. And they were right that brain regions have different functions, but their methodology was way off. Bumps on your skull turn out to in no way reflect the underlying brain anatomy or ability. Gage's injury, however, provided real evidence that personality and cognitive functions are tied to particular brain regions, and in this case the frontal lobes. The fact that a profound change in temperament followed damage to Gage's frontal cortex didn't discard phrenology completely, but it did significantly refine our understanding of cerebral localization, shifting it away from a simplistic skull bump reading towards something more scientifically supported, anatomical mappings of brain function. Scientific author Sam Keane noted that Gage was, quote, the first and arguably the most important case to reveal that complex functions, such as decision-making and social cognition, are largely dependent on the frontal lobes. In other words, Gage helped shift the scientific world towards true localization of function, the idea that different parts of the brain contribute to different aspects of mind and behavior. Meanwhile, phrenology's skull bump approach soon fell out of fashion. And have you seen the maps they came up with? Yeah, those weren't accurate either. Gage's tragic accident has become a cornerstone of neurology and psychology textbooks, illustrating how a lesion in the frontal lobe can selectively disrupt personality or executive control. The lesson has been both fascinating as well as a little bit unsettling. Aspects of what make us truly us actually reside in distinct chunks of neural real estate. Insights from Gage's injury reverberated throughout medicine, and sometimes in unexpected ways. By proving that the frontal lobes govern personality and social behavior, Gage's case inspired both scientific advances as well as some rather dark medical experiments. Research into the frontal cortex exploded, and soon scientists raced to map other brain functions, so enthusiastically so that the period between 1870 and 1890 is sometimes called the golden age of cerebral localization. Scientists studied stroke patients and other victims of localized brain injuries, linking regions like Broca's area to speech, or the occipital lobe to vision. This momentum carried into the 20th century, and by the 1930s, interest in the frontal lobes was intense. In 1935, an international neurological congress in London convened a special symposium on the frontal lobe function. At that meeting, neuroscientists John Fulton and Carlisle Jacobson presented their findings from experiments on chimpanzees. They trained two chimps to perform tricky tasks for food rewards, and they had noted that the animals would get frustrated and angry when they made mistakes. Fulton and Jacobson then surgically removed the chimp's frontal lobes and observed that afterwards the chimps became unnaturally calm and, quote, immune to frustration, albeit a little bit worse at the tasks. This finding, that removing the frontal lobe tissue seemed to dull emotional outbursts without entirely crippling the animal, made a huge impression on the audience. One person in attendance at the meeting was Portuguese neurologist Dr. Agaz Muniz. Muniz drew inspiration from these results and hypothesized that surgically cutting the frontal lobe's connections might alleviate severe psychiatric disorders in humans, like intractable depression or schizophrenia. Later in 1935, Moniz and surgeon Almeida Lima performed the first human frontal lobe surgery for mental illness. They drilled holes in the patient's skull and injected pure ethanol into the frontal lobe to destroy the white matter fibers. In subsequent patients, Moniz used a small steel wire loop called a leucotome to cut the connections deep in the frontal lobe. Moniz coined the procedure leucotomy, from the Greek word for white, leuko, and cutting, tomi, referring to slicing the brain's white matter. This procedure later widely became known as the frontal lobotomy and was soon exported around the world. Moniz himself reportedly claimed success, and in 1949 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for, quote, the discovery of the therapeutic value of prefrontal leucotomy in certain psychoses. For a time in the late 1930s and 40s, frontal lobotomy or psychosurgery was hailed as a breakthrough. Influential figures like American neurologist Walter Freeman embraced it and aggressively promoted it in the United States. Freeman, along with neurosurgeon James Watts, refined the technique and performed hundreds of the operations. Famously, Freeman developed an even quicker method called the transorbital lobotomy, in which case an instrument resembling an ice pick is inserted through the patient's eye socket to sever the frontal lobe's connections without opening the skull. Tens of thousands of lobotomies were performed worldwide by the early 1950s. And sadly, while some of the patients did show reduced agitation or psychoses, most experienced devastating side effects. Patients often suffered losses in their personality, their initiative, their empathy, their ability to function independently. Echoes of Phineas Gage's deficits, but sometimes far worse. Some were left with childlike docility or severe cognitive impairment. Others were permanently institutionalized. There was also a high risk of complications like seizures, paralysis, or even death. And by the 1950s, the medical community grew increasingly uneasy with lobotomy's inhumane consequences, especially as the first psychiatric drugs like Thorazine in 1952 began to offer non-surgical ways to calm patients. Psychosurgery rapidly fell out of favor, and today the lobotomy is regarded as a grave mistake, one of the greatest failings in medicine in recent history. It's an ironic legacy that Phineas Gage's ordeal also indirectly sparked a misguided era of frontal lobe surgeries. The lesson learned at terrible cost was that the frontal lobes are indeed crucial for making us who we are, and cutting them is no trivial matter. Phineas Gage survived for almost 12 years after his accident. He went on to work as a coach driver in New Hampshire and even Chile for a time, regaining some social function although never quite becoming the same man. Eventually, he began suffering epileptic seizures as a likely consequence of the trauma, and he died in 1860 at the age of 36. Gage's skull and the infamous tamping iron were preserved and are now on display at Harvard Medical School's Warren Anatomical Museum, grim artifacts of a case that has been retold in countless textbooks and lectures. His story continues to fascinate neuroscientists, psychologists, and the public alike. Over the years, numerous analyses and even high-tech digital reconstructions of Gage's injury have been performed. For example, a 2012 study used CT scans of Gage's skull together with modern neuroimaging data to simulate the exact path of the rod through his skull, and also which neural networks would have been disrupted. Here you can see a connectivity map that represents connections in normal subjects, and here you can see the connections that were damaged in the simulation. Such work refines our understanding of how damage to Gage's frontal lobe led to behavioral changes by mapping which circuits were destroyed. Each new analysis adds a piece to the puzzle of how brain structure relates to function. More broadly speaking, Phineas Gage's case is a classic example of a lesion study, examining how damage to a specific part of the brain affects behavior and mental function. However, nature's experiments like Gage's accident are obviously uncontrolled. No two injuries are the same, and often the damage isn't neatly confined to one area. Over time, scientists sought more systematic ways to use lesions to study the brain. They began performing lesion experiments in animals, for example, surgically removing or disabling specific areas, observing behavioral outcomes, just as Fulton and Jacobson did with chimpanzees. Modern neuroscience has evolved beyond crude permanent lesions to techniques that can temporarily or precisely inactivate neural circuits, often non-invasively. For instance, researchers today use methods like optogenetics, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or focused ultrasound to study brain function without waiting for accidents. And if you want to know more about how those methods work, let me know in the comments below. Thanks to these technologies, lesion studies today are more precise and ethical, allowing scientists to explore cause and effect in the brain while minimizing harm. We no longer have to rely on rare cases like Phineas Gage to peek into the brain's inner workings. We can actively investigate how specific brain circuits contribute to behavior, cognition, and personality. Gage's legacy lives on in every modern neuroscience lab that uses these tools, as they all stem from the fundamental realization that to understand what a brain region does, sometimes you have to see what happens when it's gone. Despite all we've learned since 1848, Phineas Gage's story continues to provoke deep questions, not just for neuroscience, but for everybody, our understanding of ourselves. The case forces us to confront the idea that aspects of our identity and personality reside in the physical matter of the brain, and that altering that matter can dramatically change a person. If a man's behavior and character can be so altered by a tamping iron's path, what does that imply about free will, personal responsibility, or what one might call the soul? Are we any more than the sum of our neural circuits? These can be challenging questions. His unfortunate accident and miraculous survival became an illuminating scientific lesson. Cases like Gage's highlight the close relationship between what we call the brain and the mind, neurology and psychiatry. His life, split into a before and after on that fateful September day, reminds us just how much who we are depends on the delicate biology of a jelly-like organ floating inside of our skulls. It's a tale equal parts horrifying, fascinating, and humbling. And that's the end of this story. Let me know in the comments what you think, and also what other topics in neuroscience, psychology, or philosophy you'd like to explore. There are plenty more incredible stories of the brain revealing its secrets. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.